In this video, I'm going to show you how to do your in-text documentation for poetry. So this is going to focus on the special rules for documenting poetry in your essay. So everything I'm not talking about is going to be the same, things like signal phrases and putting quotes around the quoted material. I'm really here just focusing on what's different about poetry. So number one, when you do poetry, you of course have line breaks. So you put a slash with a space on either side of it to show where the line breaks are. So that's what you're seeing here. So this is a Tennyson poem, and we've got one line of the poem, and then it would break here and go onto the next line. So you show with just a slash where that line break is, and we have another one because this is 3 lines from the poem. Some people make the mistake of doing like this. They don't have any space, and that's wrong. You have to have a space on both sides of that. All right. Also, what's different is you use line numbers instead of page numbers. You don't put the page number for poetry. You put the lines in the poem. So this is line 13, 14, and 15. So you just put that there, just like you would the page numbers. We have the author's name here because we don't have the author in the signal phrase. If we did, we wouldn't repeat it there, but we don't in here. So we have Tennyson space and then just the line numbers. So those are the two things that are probably the most different about citing poetry in your essay, that you put slashes where the line breaks are and you put line numbers in place of page numbers. Now, in the case that you're doing a longer quote, the rules are a little different for poetry as well. So first of all, there's a difference in terms of when you need to do a long quote. So in prose, right, anything that's not poetry, it's when you have more than 4 lines in your essay, right? The quote is more than 4 lines long. But with poetry, use that long quote or block quote format when you're quoting more than 3 lines of poetry. So it's triggered sooner. And there you're not counting how many lines it takes up in your essay, you're counting the actual lines of a poem. So here in the above example, we just had 3. So if you have 1, 2, or 3 lines, you don't need to do the long quote. Once you get over 3, even if it's one word over 3, then you do. Okay, so you count the lines of the poem, and this is how you would format it. Okay, so just like any other long quote, it must be introduced with a complete sentence followed by a colon, which is the 2 dots. So it can't just be something like Tennyson says, comma, that doesn't work. You've got to have a complete sentence followed by a colon. And then the way you present the lines of the poem is the same way that they appear in the poem, right? It's almost like you cut and paste that section of the poem into your essay, right? So that's exactly how it looks in the poem. You double space it, of course, which in the original text it might not have, and you indent it, and of course it's on another line, but it's set off with white space here so we know it's a quote. You don't put quotation marks around a long quote, right? That's true for any kind of long quote. So no quotation marks around the long quote. And interestingly, the period comes right after the last word of the quote, not after the parentheses. That's a difference, by the way, from when you're doing a quote that's not in the long quote format. Usually the period comes here instead at the end of the quote. I don't know why it's different, but in a long quote, the period goes there. And of course, we have the author's name and the line number. So we didn't have the author in the signal phrase. If Tennyson were in the signal phrase, we wouldn't have it here. So you very often just have line numbers. And these are lines 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So that's why it's 10 through 15. No period there because it's the long quote. And then you come down on the next line to start your own language. All right. And And by the way, just keep in mind for some of the regular quotes not to make some of the common mistakes people make, like forgetting to leave a space between the end quote and the initial parentheses, or some people forget that they have to put the period at the end of the parentheses in a regular quote, not at the end of the quote itself. Of course, that's different for a block quote. Some people also put their quotation marks like here. That's wrong. You never have it after the parentheses. You always have it before. So keep some of those things in mind. Of course, also make sure you always have a signal phrase. That goes for any kind of quoting. You always introduce the quote, I guess it's that part, with a signal phrase that flows into it, never starting just with a quote by itself. Okay, so keep that in mind. Keep these rules in mind when you're doing the in-text documentation for your essay about poetry.